folks who are audience who is coming in right now to History Lunch Break. I'm Glenn Perkins. I got Warren Milteer here to talk about free people of color in early North Carolina. We're going to get started in just a moment once I get this live stream hooked up on the Facebook. But don't forget that you are already making use of the chat, which is fantastic. So do that, say hi. And if you got questions for us as we're going along, be sure to put them into the Q&A and I will share them with Dr. Milteer as we move along with our conversation. So, and look, you've already got somebody who's bought the book. So, right, so here we go. And it's Friday and time for another History Lunch Break. My name is Glenn Perkins and I'm here from the Greensboro History Museum. Today we're talking about complexities of color in early and antebellum North Carolina. And I'm thrilled to welcome my guest, Dr. Warren Milteer Jr. of the UNCG Department of History, whose book, North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885, was published by LSU Press last year. Welcome, Dr. Milteer.
Thank you, Glenn, for having me.
I'm so excited to have you because this is such an interesting topic and one that kind of throws some of our assumptions about the ways history works on their head a little bit. So start by telling me a little bit about what drew you to this topic to start with.
All right, yeah, so I got interested in the topic of free people of color, I'd say 20, 25 years ago. First, it came out of my interest in my family. So I'm a descendant of free people of color. And that interest eventually drove me to the archives. Once I got in the archives, I found a lot of interesting things. And by the time I was in college, I decided to write an honors thesis about free people of color. And from there, I stuck with the topic through grad school, wrote a dissertation about the topic, and now I have a book based on that dissertation.
So you've really been working on this, devotedly for years and years and years. Did you think that, when you're writing your honors thesis, that it was something that you'd still be working on down the line?
I'm not surprised.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not surprised.
I guess it says, and some of it says family connections and that personal link to the story.
Right. Yeah, because a lot of the people who've written about the topic before don't have that personal connection. And, there were certain things that I had either found out about my family or other families that I knew about that didn't seem to be reflected in the literature. And so I thought it was important for somebody who had a different understanding of the situation of free people of color to engage as an academic with the topic.
What were some of those stories, do you have an example of something that came down to you that was a story that sort of you really grabbed onto as part of your personal family history?
Right. Yeah. I think for me, the most obvious, and maybe for people who are also descendants of free communities, especially those that date back into the colonial period, is the marriage patterns, family patterns. These groups tend to kept really close relationships between families. They're families that have been together and intermarried with one another for 200 years. They're still doing it in certain cases. And I've never seen that reflected, or very rarely saw that reflected. I think, let me go back and not say never, because I think John Hope Franklin mentioned it, but he didn't really understand what was going on.
Right, and John Hope Franklin, famously, I guess, wrote his book, The Free Negro in North Carolina.
Right.
And what year was that book what year did his study come out?
That was in the 40s.
Okay.
I think it's like 42, 43, something like that.
So he was drawing on, some scholarship that came along and that's been developed a little bit over time, but you're really kind of changing some of that big idea. As from my reading of it, your big idea in the book is that legally free people of color were closer to white citizens than they were to enslaved people. And does that mean that in a lot of ways that distinction between free and enslaved was almost more important in North Carolina than the distinction between black and white, or how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at least what I'm trying to say is that we have to take that distinction between freedom and enslavement very seriously, and not allow racial categorization to blind us to those important differences between freedom and enslavement. Because if you look at the rights that free people of color have, just some of the basic rights around property ownership, being able to keep their families together, those are significant and important. And I wanted to emphasize that, along with many of the other rights that free people of color had in various times. I mean, the fact that free people of color in North Carolina, free men of color specifically, had the right to vote until 1835. I thought that was a pretty huge distinction. And there was some literature that seemed to blur that distinction between free people of color and enslaved people. And that didn't make a lot of sense to me when you have a group of people who can vote, who can actually own enslaved people, right? Like that's huge. If somebody
Hmm.
can own you, that's a major legal distinction between you and that other person. And so I thought that needed to be paid more attention to. And also, in the book, I'm trying to explain, when we do see free people of color who have a lower status in society, I want to explain why. And, there were many factors often to why somebody might be at the near the bottom of the social hierarchy, um, in addition to race. And so that's what I talk a lot about: gender distinctions, class distinctions, distinctions based on occupation and what a certain occupation gives you access to, reputation, things like that.
Yeah, and we'll have to talk about a lot of those things. But I guess one of the big questions is, so how did people get categorized as free people of color in North Carolina?
So, as far as who got categorized as free people of color in North Carolina, I mean, the general answer is this is a category that included uh, free people of either African and or Native American descent. There seem to be a few exceptions, though. We're talking about Native Americans. The Cherokee, in the case of North Carolina, are probably the major exception. Those Cherokees who lived in the Cherokee homeland were generally not referred to as free people of color, but this people who descended from some of the smaller tribes from the east, um, the Chowans, the Matamuskees. A lot of those people, by the time we were getting into the late 1700s, early 1800s, are categorized as free people of color.
And did that definition change between the colonial era when it's starting to first be applied, and then when you start to get into the early republic and early statehood in North Carolina?
No, I mean, for the most part, people, use this general definition that I just mentioned, to define who were free people of color. If there's any difference, a lot of it is localized or
Mhm.
individual more than the whole society changing its view over time as to who fits where. And I discuss in the book in greater detail the exact process that I see as far as people deciding like who is a person of color and who is not. And so I explain that there are these laws that define who's a person of color based on percentages of blood, but in reality, people are defined not by those percentages of blood per se, but more about what people remember about their ancestors, physical features, um, things like that. Those are what really end up defining who's a free person of color and who is not. And I mean, part of the reason that that is the case is that in this time period there are free people of color for all intents and purposes who quote unquote appear white, but are known in their community as free people of color. And so there are other things involved in, if in the community being able to define those people as people of color. And a lot of that has to do with local knowledge about those families' histories. Um, so, in spite of their appearance, because of what people think or understand, what their memory of these people's histories are, they end up being classified as people of color.
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting how you were talking about that one factor in sort of defining people, free people of color, was that idea of community memory and that sort of shared notion of a local witnesses, or being able to sort of testify that, so-and-so descended from this family and so-and-so was manumitted earlier on. Obviously there were documentary sources as well, right? But
Right.
that community memory was important too.
Absolutely. And I mean, sometimes that memory is contested because, this is a day and time where people are not, they don't have photographs, they don't have the types of record keeping that we have today. And so, they're depending on the word of somebody who's 80 years old and what they remembered. And those people have their own agendas when they make statements about who people's ancestors are. Because often the question comes up to determine people's rights, whether a person has the right to carry a gun, or if a person has the right to have certain people excluded from their trial if they're being tried for a crime. Those are the types of things that come up.
So were court records a really important source for you as you were trying to uncover some of these stories?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I spent quite a bit of time in the state archives in Raleigh looking at court records from all over North Carolina, different counties. The quality of those records vary from place to place, but yeah, I spent quite a bit of time looking at various series of court records.
So if you're just joining us, my name is Glenn Perkins and you're watching History Lunch Break. I'm talking to Dr. Warren Milteer about North Carolina's free people of color. If you guys have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we'll be getting to those shortly. If you're watching on Facebook, I can try to catch an eye over to the Facebook chat if you've got questions in that area. So Dr. Milteer, let's talk a little bit about some of the particular stories that you uncovered about free people of color and their experiences here in North Carolina. Here at the Greensboro History Museum, we have a little bit of information about Thomas Day, who's quite a well-known industrialist furniture maker who traveled between North Carolina and Virginia. And he's one example of a role that somebody could adopt in that as a free person of color. What are some other stories that you were really drawn to?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are so many different individuals that I
Mhm.
discuss in the book. I mean, one person, he's been written about, but I still find him pretty fascinating, would be John C. Stanley of New Bern. Uh, he was a barber. He was originally born enslaved and became free, was manumitted early in life, purchased his wife and his children out of slavery, but he was also a significant slave holder and he held people to use them for their labor. And then at the same time, also helped a lot of enslaved people to freedom beyond his family, and seems to have had some contacts with people involved in the anti-slavery cause, including some Quakers as well as anti-slavery people in the North. And so he's a very interesting figure in the fact that, he's on all sides of these different issues, and, trying to figure out, like, what does this guy really think about the issue of slavery? What is he, what are his morals? What is his line of ethics? Um, it's difficult to uncover, but at the same time, it's fascinating to see this individual who carries all of these different ideas.
Yeah, I
And
think.
go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna, sort of want to talk a little bit more about that issue of slaveholding by free people of color, sort of how commonplace was that in North Carolina. Are there other stories like Stanley's that tell you about motivations, whether it was family members, whether it was connections to, trying to manumit or just making people's lives easier? Or was it just economics?
Right. Yeah, I would say that compared to maybe a state like Louisiana, North Carolina has relatively few free people of color who hold other people as slaves. Um, at the same time, yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon. You do have some people like Stanley. They may not hold as many individuals as enslaved as Stanley did, but at the same time, you do have others who are owning, uh, holding other people as slaves because they're their family members and they're having difficulty for one reason or another freeing those people. So that exists along with uh, free people of color holding enslaved people for profit and for their financial benefit.
I think, I mean, this idea of property, right, becomes a critical piece of what it meant to be a free person of color. Whether you're holding other enslaved people or you're holding other kinds of property, is that, does that become a point of argument or a point of discussion as the white decision makers in the state try to figure out where free people of color belong in North Carolina under their control?
Yeah, I mean, in North Carolina and across the South, there's always these efforts by people I describe as pro-slavery extremists to limit the interactions between free people of color and enslaved people. And one thing that they do try to do, and eventually are successful to some degree in doing, is trying to prevent free people of color from owning slaves. Um, because their whole point is to try to make the situation of free people of color and enslaved people as similar as possible. And of course, this is one of the major distinctions between enslaved people and free people of color, is the ability of free people of color to hold other people as slaves. And so these radical extremists are always trying to take that right away from free people of color, which is a problem for free people of color, not only those who are trying to gain financially, but also those who are trying to hold their family members as slaves in order to keep their families together.
And of course, there's also reactions. You mentioned the stripping free men of color of the right to vote in 1835. So what was the real push that you have, as far as you understand it, in that legislation in North Carolina?
To a certain degree, it kind of relates to what I was just saying. So there are these people in this 1835 Constitutional Convention who decide to bring up the issue of free people of color being able to vote. And many of those who argue to take away the vote from free people of color um, base that on the fact that they don't believe that free people of color, are equal to white people, that their status should be closer to that of enslaved people. Um, One thing that I mentioned in the book, and if you read the book, you can learn more about this in detail, is that it seems that some of these pro-slavery extremists, however, were not purely motivated by um, the goal of trying to put free people of color in a place more similar to enslaved people, but they were also trying to get rid of their political competition, or people who supported their political competition. Um, and that's often what you see, is that these people who come together to restrict the rights of free people of color are there for a variety of reasons. They're in coalition with other people who have goals beyond purely racial discrimination. It's part of the story, but it's not the whole story.
Um, I mean, was there a sense that there was coalition building and some political influence among free people of color, especially ones, who did have some economic capital built up?
Yeah, I mean, at different times, and probably depending on your locality as well, there are, especially I would say by this time period, Democrats who see free people of color as being more aligned with the Whig Party. And in the earlier time period, there was also similar stereotype about free people of color being aligned with the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. And so that plays a role too. Now, the actuality of that, it's really hard to tell. We don't know precisely, what percentage of free people of color voted for which candidates in which elections. And from what I can tell, there probably was a mix. You see free people of color who named their children after Democratic politicians, even some as notorious as John C. Calhoun. So with that being the case, I can't imagine that a free person of color named they would have named their child after John C. Calhoun and not have saw themselves as tied to the Democratic Party in some way.
That is that's a pretty that's a pretty bold bold way of tying of declaring your political affiliation for
Absolutely.
sure. And you mentioned some of these these communities growing up, and specifically, where did you find that there were like geographically clusters of free people of color, and where were those in North Carolina over time?
Right. Yeah. I mean, they're free people of color throughout the state, but generally speaking, there are more of them in the Piedmont and the eastern part of the state than in the mountains. Um, as far as specific locations with large populations, I'm thinking like Craven County, Halifax, Pasquotank, Hertford, um, Robeson, Wake County, Granville County. Um, those areas in particular had significant populations of free people of color. Um, there are others as well that, depending on the time period, will have a relatively significant number of free people of color. And when I'm thinking significant, by the 1860s, probably over 1,000 free people of color, because by that time there were 30,000 total in the state.
Mm-hmm. And so, as a percentage, Kate wants to know, sort of as a percentage of free people of color at any, you can pick a decade or a census. What was the relationship to the number of free people of color versus number of enslaved people?
Right. So in 1860, we're talking about 30,000 free people of color to about over 300,000 enslaved people.
Yeah, so I guess
Yeah.
minuscule in comparison. And so folks have a lot of great questions and discussion going on in the chat about different surnames and family names. And you mentioned your own connections. Did you get familiar with certain surnames or families who in different parts of the state as you were doing your research and seeing these names pop up in different places?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to if you really want to understand what's going on. I think, again, that was something that I was paying attention to that maybe some of the previous scholarship had not paid as much attention to. Yeah, but and depending on the county, I was able to figure out more of those connections than in others. Um, in communities where you have free people of color who had been there since the colonial period, you do tend to see deeper family ties and interconnections. So, say in places like Craven County, Robeson County, Hertford County, to some extent, even out in this area, you see some of that as well.
And was there some mobility? Ramona asks a question in the Q&A about her ancestors who followed Joseph Willis out of North Carolina to Louisiana in the early 1800s, and was kind of wondering sort of what motivation that family may have had then.
Right.
But to connect that, was there other mobility among free people of color within or going outside of the state?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there were free people of color from North Carolina going all over the country, especially towards the west. But even to the north, you'll see free people of color from North Carolina who lived in places like Philadelphia, Boston, places like that. But as far as going west, I mean, a lot of people are going out there for opportunity, just like everybody else who's leaving the East Coast. They're free people of color who are able to obtain land grants in certain instances, or they're able to buy land pretty cheaply and set up farms and try to make a better life for themselves. And there are cases also, especially as we get later into the 1800s, where free people of color are deciding to leave North Carolina because of concerns about discrimination and the threats of increased discrimination. Because by the time we get into the 1850s, there are plots being talked about publicly by these pro-slavery extremists about enslaving free people of color. And so I think some free people of color are scared of that talk, and they decide to get out before they find out whether it's going to happen or not. In the case of North Carolina, it did not happen. Um, the members of the General Assembly ultimately decided that they did not think that that was constitutional to enslave a free person, that you could not legally do that. Um, Even though there were a few individuals who made that one of their center issues, and so they would bring these bills up over and over again.
But we're talking about, so for example, even during the Civil War, there are still free people of color sort of existing within this state that's rebelling, in a
Right.
and
Right.
taking part in a war to ensure slavery. But I guess one
Absolutely.
view was going to be that that was about liberty rather than maybe about color.
Well, I mean, by the time you're getting to the Civil War, the state of North Carolina needs the free people of color, especially young men, to do labor.
Mm-hmm.
So they're sending a lot of these young men from the coast and the eastern part of the interior of the state to work on fortifications um, in order to protect the state from the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy coming in. So they become important for that reason. And under that circumstance, yeah, you don't want the free people of color to leave anymore. That's not a good idea. Nobody's going to support that. And I mean, that's often the case, just in general, why these plots to remove free people of color are not successful is that even before the war, business interests don't want that to happen. They need the labor of these free people of color. Some of them are, skilled artisans, but also just your more common laborers. They're needed.
And you do extend the book past the Civil War, and why is that? I mean, when that distinction, supposedly between free and enslaved, doesn't exist, but I guess it's changed to become a different kind of distinction. And again, that color question becomes even more important to the folks trying to uphold white supremacy within the state.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I decided to go beyond the war, first of all, because I had not seen much discussion in the case of North Carolina concerning what happens to free people of color after the war. And also to signify that some of the trends that I found before the war continue with free people of color. Um, some free people of color in the post-war period see themselves as distinct from the former enslaved population. Now they're also willing to work in coalition with the formerly enslaved population, but that doesn't mean that they see themselves as the same. And so I spent a little bit of time both talking about the coalition building, but also talking about the ways that some free people of color decide to continue to distinguish themselves from the larger mass of people of color.
This has been so interesting, and we're getting close to the end of the time, but I do have a couple of questions that I need to, there goes bells, that I need to, that I want to pass along with you. Pat, who's asked a question about your own family stories that influenced that. And she wanted to know, was some of your family enslaved even as others were free people of color?
Yes, there were. Yeah.
So you're getting the family stories and those things coming down from both those realities.
Right.
Let's see. John wants to know how an enslaved individual became a free person of color other than buying their freedom or through hiring out.
Right. Well, I mean, if the person who holds them as a slave wants to manumit them or grant
Mhm.
them legal freedom, they can be freed that way. Sometimes people are purchased by their family members and then freed as well. So beyond just laboring and then saving your money and buying your freedom, you could be freed those ways as well.
And were there other kinds of trades or skills that allowed, people, especially sort of with those artisan abilities, to, either purchase or be manumitted?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easier for people with um, those specialized skills like barbers, blacksmiths, other people with skilled trades. It's easier for them, especially men with skilled trades, to purchase themselves out of slavery. Of course, you need to still have somebody who's willing to work with you to do that. But yeah, they do seem to have an easier time with self purchase.
And William wants to know about the county court records after, with the new state constitution in 1868. Is there a change in how people are documented, I guess, in those county court records after 1868?
Yeah, so as far as yeah, the county court records, I mean, the terminology of free people of color starts to disappear
Mm-hmm.
after the war, so that distinction is not there. Right as the war ends and immediately after the war, there is a mix of usage. Some counties will use freed men or freed people or something of that nature for the formerly enslaved people, and then free people of color for those who have been free before and during the war. Um, yeah, and I mean, as time goes on, you're just going to end up with general race terms if race is mentioned at all. Somebody will just be labeled as colored or Negro or something like that.
Canetta wants to know about whether you've discovered contracts that document free people of color voluntarily or involuntarily going into a free person of color bonded slaveholder relationships, or were there specific laws requiring a free person of color to be bonded into slavery? Or
Yeah, so I mean, there are records of people attempting to do that,
Mhm.
but the General Assembly doesn't recognize those connections as legal in North Carolina. In Virginia, it was a different case, but North Carolina, that wasn't recognized. So they may have drawn up contracts that weren't legal, though. So those people would not have actually been enslaved. You could not become a free person. You couldn't be a free person of color and then legally become a slave. Now there are people who are kidnapped and taken to
Mhm.
other places and enslaved in that manner, but no, not through a legal relationship. That the state did not recognize that. But there are records that show that type of relationship.
And Jared, speaking of records, Jared wants to know whether you found interesting, useful sources within the Freedmen's Bureau records.
Yeah, there are a few interesting sources in the Freedmen Bureau's records, and this, I think I used some of those records, especially for the last chapter of the book, because there's some recollections of what was going on during the Civil War in those records, and also you can see how free people of color are participating in the early days of Reconstruction. You find letters often written by free people of color on behalf of themselves and also the formerly enslaved population. Some free people of color are teachers, and so you'll see them writing on behalf of their school to the Freedmen's Bureau or making complaints because they've been attacked by former rebels. There's all kinds of stuff in there.
I can only imagine there's so many great sources. And I know that you have another book coming out, Free People of Color in the South. When's that book coming out?
It should be out late summer, early fall.
And so you'll be talking about this and kind of bringing this discussion to a much more regional focus. So
Exactly.
I'm going to look forward to it. I hope maybe I can have you back. We can talk a little bit more about what makes North Carolina different from some of those other places. I think we'll have so many questions. But
Sounds good.
yeah, again, I really appreciate you taking time to talk with us. Our guest today, Dr. Warren Milteer. Thanks to our audience for joining us for today's History Lunch Break. I do want to say the History Lunch Break will be back next week. My colleague John Zachman here at the museum will be behind the counter. He's talking to James Stewart, who's the University Archivist at North Carolina A&T, about Aggie veterans of World War I. There's some amazing stories between the connections of that campus and service during the Great War. I'm putting the link for that in the chat. You can go ahead and sign up right now, or you can go visit our website, greensborohistory.org, that has all kinds of programs coming up for the coming weeks, as well as don't forget to follow our social media accounts and subscribe to our e-news. Hope to see you next time on History Lunch Break. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.